Welcome back to another edition of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrec. Once again this year, I'm excited to bring you the annual StrategyCorp Year in Review and 2025 Look Ahead podcast episode. There was no shortage of major developments in Canada and abroad this year, so I asked my colleagues to further insight. We also talked about what they were keeping their eyes on in 2025. With Donald Trump returning to the White House, something tells me 2025 will be quite eventful, but more on Donald Trump later. I actually want to start this episode at the federal level, where one of the biggest political developments of the year came in the second half of December. I'm obviously talking about Chrystia Freeland resigning from her role as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance on the very day she was supposed to table the government's fall economic statement. Needless to say, this sent the government and the broader Ottawa ecosystem into a massive frenzy. For a bit, we didn't even know if there would be a fall economic statement. The document was ultimately tabled in the House of Commons, but without a speech. Here's my colleague Andrew Steele, a vice president in our government relations team, on why Chrystia Freeland resigning was such a major development.
The most important story out of Ottawa this year, I think, was Chrystia Freeland's departure from cabinet. Not so much because it changes policy. I don't think Dominic LeBlanc is going to be that much of a different finance minister from Freeland, but because it changes the internal dynamic in the Liberal Party. So where there's been this kind of truce within the Liberal Party since at least to 2012, where leadership politics is not what we're engaging in, that the debilitating disease that overtook the party from the John Turner, Pierre Trudeau fights all the way up to Michael Ignatieff. It was time to kind of bury the hatchet on that and support the leader and move forward. I think that the breach with Freeland has created the situation where the gloves are possibly coming off. And that changes things in a way within the governing party of the country.
It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out for the federal Liberals with an election coming up in 2025. Speaking of elections, there was plenty of them in Canada and abroad in 2024. Here's Stephen Barber, a VP in our management consulting group on this.
There were obviously a number of developments and events that happened in 2024, but what really stood out to me were election outcomes across democracies in the Western world. Now, when we look at the UK and their election, massive change from a Conservative majority to a Labour majority. France's snap election at the beginning of July, South Korea's recent failed coup, and of course, who can ignore the re-election of President Trump in the US? We also had numerous provincial elections across Canada, with NDP Premier Eby re-elected in BC, Scott Moe re-elected in Saskatchewan, both with significantly reduced majorities. We saw change in government in New Brunswick. And this says to me that the electorate is agitated. Now, I think democracy reflects the electorate, and I think we're going to see that going forward still. An agitated electorate looking for changes, not happy with what's happening in their economy, in their social fabric, and I think that's what we're going to see going forward.
In the United States, the electorate turned the White House red by electing Donald Trump as president. Here are Allison Grant, a director with our GR team, and Jeff Mahon, director of our geopolitical and international business advisory practice, on why this was a major development and what it could mean for Canada.
I think unequivocally the most important development for Canada in 2024 was the election of Donald Trump. It affects Trudeau politically as leader of the Liberal Party, but also on the policy front. Politically, a Harris win might have provided some progressive momentum for the Trudeau team to ride on, but I actually think that Trump's victory was probably the preferred outcome from a political perspective, because it provides a convenient foe that a lot of Canadians don't really identify with. At the same time, they have to walk a very careful line in any criticism of Trump because he's extremely sensitive to it. On a policy front, we've so far avoided going into a recession post-pandemic, but Trump's tariff threats pose a pretty unprecedented potential challenge for us. I think Trudeau was actually right to go down and have dinner with him in Florida recently, and try to do everything he can to ensure that Canada is part of a North American economic plan rather than being cut out of it. And he's going to just have to grin and bear the trolling online that's been happening from the president since he went down there.
Another important event is, of course, the election of Donald Trump. But what I think really matters in that for Canadians is the impact of policymaking here in Canada. So with the recent 25% tariff threat, which is a form of economic coercion to get Canada to adjust and to address a completely different policy issue through the use of punitive tariffs, Canada is going to be facing a lot more pressure to align with the US on a number of issues, whether it's fentanyl, border crisis, or China. And we were already seeing that starting to take shape with the Biden administration when Canada launched the 100% tariffs on electric vehicles.
There's no doubt Canada will feel the effects of a second Trump presidency. We'll touch on this a bit later in our Look Ahead segment. But beyond the impacts on Canada, my colleague Molly Shibnovsky, a vice president with our communication team, highlighted how the US election played out from a communications perspective.
So for me, the easiest way to talk about the events of 2024 is to think about the US election, but not so much in the political sense, but more from a communications perspective, how we saw both candidates talking to people and sort of the outlets that they were using to do that. Because I think one thing that we really saw in 2024 was the media landscape continuing to change. And what I mean by that is traditional interviews are becoming less tenable. There's less media that we can speak to. There's less journalists doing real reporting. And so instead, non-traditional outlets are really taking a front seat. So what we saw a lot in the election, but what we saw just sort of throughout all of our clients and throughout the communications that we were paying attention to was that things like podcasts and blogs are becoming more trusted sources for people out in the world. So people are no longer trusting of traditional media outlets like CNN and Fox in the US, or like the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star here in Canada. Instead, they're looking to niche outlets where they trust the person who sort of is running that outlet, or they trust the interviewer to have sort of their best interest. So if we think about the election, both Trump and Harris chose podcasts that they felt were sort of indicative of the audience that they were trying to reach, and they used those platforms to talk to the people that they'd hoped would vote for them.
Well, you can definitely count on this podcast as a source of trusted information. Okay, let's leave the US election for a few minutes to discuss other important developments that took place in Ontario in 2024. Here are Ramneek Bala and Alex Glista, two managers at StrategyCorp, with their takes on what stood out this year.
Over the last few years, you've really seen the Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation, and Trade, Minister Fedeli, and the Premier really doubled down on making Ontario a manufacturing hub and bringing back good-paying jobs to Ontario. And you know what? They've been quite successful in doing that. They've made significant investments through the electric vehicle supply chain strategy. They brought in a lot of new manufacturing jobs. They've really shaped Ontario in being a leader in the nation for job creation and innovation.
Well, for myself in the land and infrastructure development space, in Ontario, it was the de-emphasis of the importance of housing. The Ontario government used to very much stick to the 1.5 million homes by 2030 goal. And that's something that they moved away from. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First off, being that housing starts were not meeting the targets they needed to meet this goal. And second off, the economy as a whole was not really supportive for building more homes. So we saw the province move away from promoting pro-housing policies and talking about housing left, right, and center to other issues, for example, gridlock reduction. We've seen the province make huge investments in things like transportation and highways. The PC government in Ontario here has been very, very loud about promises like Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass. And we've also seen them come out with other promises and policies like advancing studies on a 401 tunnel, which may not actually be grounded in reality, but there's something that they used to get voters' attention and show that they're really moving forward on trying to tackle gridlock, especially in the Toronto area where people are feeling stuck.
Hearing Alex talk about gridlock and traffic reminds me that really all politics are local. Speaking of the local level, Ontario municipalities faced several important challenges in 2024. My colleague Stacey Hutchin is a vice president and she has a ton of municipal knowledge. So here's what she had to say on this.
Yeah, so I have the advantage of leading our annual Chief Administrative Officer or City Manager survey, where we interview senior municipal administrators from across Ontario. So I'm always kind of tracking what's happening municipally year over year. And what I will say is that this year, what stands out is not some major singular event, but really the incremental leveling up of the growing challenges in Ontario communities, big, small, GTA, northern, rural, and I'm talking here about homelessness, mental health, and substance use issues. And of course, none of these just happened in 2024, but what we've seen is the crisis grow and become more visible. And, AMO found last year that there were over 1,400 homelessness encampments in municipalities across Ontario. And what we're seeing and bearing witness to is the distressing impacts of this crisis on individuals and communities across Ontario in terms of how they relate to each other, how people engage with each other. And it feels in many ways like a real pressure cooker environment right now. We've seen increasing tensions between neighbors and residents, but also between residents and councils at public meetings, council meetings.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, 2024 was eventful until the very, very end. 2025 will probably continue in this trend. And there are a lot of different topics my colleagues will be keeping an eye on in 2025, as you can imagine. But let's begin at the municipal level to start this segment. Here's Stacey Hutchin on what she'll be following closely.
Specifically, I think we're going to keep our eyes on watching the social crisis in Ontario communities and the reaction of municipalities and how they respond to that. I think the real question facing so many municipalities right now is how to rebuild a healthy local democracy, mindful of those community tensions, how to rebuild trust in the relationship between government and the people it serves, and how to do that when the humanitarian challenges outside of town hall, are not showing any signs of easing or slowing down. And so I think that's something we'll absolutely be keeping our eyes on. On a different note, it's also budget season for municipalities. And, last year in our CAO survey, we saw a willingness of many mayors and councils to support above inflationary increases to taxes and rates, often for the first time. But the real question we have is, will the resolve hold this year for 2025, particularly as we're now less than 2 years out from the next municipal election?
But before we have municipal elections, we will definitely have a federal election next year. If rumors are true, there might also be a provincial election in Ontario. Here are Alison Grant and Ramneek Bala talking respectively about a federal and a provincial election.
In 2025, I'm going to keep my eyes on the polls here in Canada. I mean, it's very unprecedented that the Conservatives have been up essentially by up to 20 points for over a year. And we're still technically 9 to 10 months away from the next scheduled election date. So we'll be watching those polls and watching the obvious windows for the next federal election.
To no one's surprise, it'll be important to keep a close eye on all party platforms as they ramp up for the scheduled election in 2026, while rumors swirl on a potential early election in 2025. We've already started to see parties begin to stake out their positions on key issues such as housing, healthcare, and affordability, but the platforms and policies will be continuing to grow. The current polls put the Premier and the PC party significantly ahead of their rivals, and they'll have to come up with a strategy that shows their commitment to Ontarians in continuing to hold them in a strong position in the polls. I think the biggest challenge that the Liberal leader and Bonnie Crombie and NDP leader Merritt Stiles will have is building name recognition. The Premier has done a great job of that. He's a recognized name across households in Ontario, but Bonnie Crombie and Merritt Stiles still have some work to do on that. So while they put out their policies and platforms, they'll also have to work on being everywhere across the province to really build party and name recognition.
Ramneek mentioned housing. It's definitely a topic all three levels of government are thinking about. Alex Glista shared his thoughts on where housing might be going in 2025.
So across Canada, we've seen a slow but noticeable rebound in housing construction and starts. It's not like it was at the peak of the heyday of building homes, condos, single-family homes, et cetera, across Canada. But with the rates being cut across Canada, there's more people who are now able to look at being able to buy property, whether it's their first-time property or an investment property or another property. So that sector hopefully is something that begins to rebound a little bit.
Okay, so far we've talked about the federal level in Ontario a decent amount, so I want to cover Western Canada now. My colleague Stefan Barber is StrategyCorp's Vice President for Western Canada on the management consulting side, so he has a unique perspective on what to keep an eye on in 2025 in that part of Canada.
In Western Canada, I'm really keeping my eye on two key considerations for the West. I'm looking at energy generation, and I'm looking at President Trump's re-election and what that means for trade. On energy generation, I'm really looking at how will we move to generate the electricity demands of the future in a reliable, renewable, potentially green, and affordable way for residential and industrial use. Saskatchewan's been looking at nuclear. Manitoba, of course, is hydroelectric power, but also is the Pinawan nuclear site that could be used for small modular reactors. BC is hydro, Alberta is looking at wind and other forms of generation, and electricity generation is really the backbone of our economy and our standard of living. So that's something I'm keeping a close eye on for 2025. The other item I'm looking at for 2025 is President Trump election and what that means for trade in Western Canada. Now, Premier Eby has made the comment that he's looking to expand interprovincial trade. Now, that might work for Western Canada, but the gap between Winnipeg and Ontario in terms of transit of goods is so large that it's really easier for Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia to trade south with our partners in the US. And so with President Trump's proposed tariffs and potential other measures that he might come up with that would impact trade, I'm really keeping an eye on what the premiers in Western Canada will do to mitigate any of those changes and to solidify the Western Canadian economy.
Stefan's point about energy and trade raised the questions of economic security. Wearing his geopolitical and international business advisory practice hat, Jeff Mahan told me during the recording that economic security is really something he'll be keeping a close eye on in 2025.
What I'm keeping my eyes on for 2025 is the continued rise of the economic security regime, which is a change in our international political economy model, where it's no longer supply and demand forces that are the only things driving commercial activity, whether it's trade and investment, but an increasing role for government intervention, whether it's industrial policy or punitive trade measures or trade wars, etc. The case that matters, I think, the most here is the rise of China and US's reaction to that, which is reverberating across the world, including to Canada. So Canada needs to be concerned about economic security because while it is an important step to protect both jobs, growth, and our overall national security, it does present a slippery slope to trade protectionism and attendant policy distortions. Companies or interest groups will use economic security language to argue for special protections, which could end up hurting Canadian economic competitiveness and consumers. So it's going to be a tough balance to protect the real economic security interests from those that are looking to rent seek.
As Jeff highlights, economic security gets defined differently depending on who's talking and for what purpose. I think increasingly disruptive technologies like AI and quantum will be part of the economic security discussion. Given all the coverage it received this year, AI is actually a great topic to conclude this episode. My colleague Molly Shivnowski shared how she'll be keeping an eye on the technology in 2025.
In 2025, I'm keeping my eye on AI, like I'm sure most people are, but in a different way than I have been in the past. So in the past, when I looked at AI, I was looking at it more from, is it here to stay? What are the new technologies going to look like? How is that going to integrate into our sort of everyday work life? But now I think it's clear that AI has a role, and what that role is where I'll be looking in 2025. So less about, which service offers the most compelling things, and more about how can we use these language models to help us with our work. So how can we continue to sort of stay at the center of AI and use AI to help us get better rather than to sort of replace us, especially from a communications perspective. We know our clients better than any AI ever will, at least for now, because we still have that human-centered perspective. But what we can do is use AI services to help elevate the work that we're doing and to help us sort of think differently.
Well, just like 2024, this year's episode of the Strategy Corp Year in Review and Look Ahead episode has come and gone. I hope you enjoyed all the great insight my colleagues shared in this podcast. I personally found their 2025 Look Ahead analysis particularly helpful as I start getting ready for next year. As we go into 2025, you can trust that Strategy Corp and the Institute will have you covered with insight and thought leadership on the biggest developments and what they mean for Canada and for you. A huge thank you to my colleagues Molly Shivnowski, Stacey Hutchin, Alex Glista, Jeff Mahan, Allison Grant, Ramnik Bala, Stefan Barber, and Andrew Steele for making time for this special episode. I could not have done it without them. I hope you enjoyed the fall season of Intended Consequences. Thank you to all our guests, and obviously thank you for listening to the episodes. I look forward to discussing more fascinating topics in 2025. In the meantime, I wish everyone a wonderful and safe holiday season and a happy new year. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next year. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.